So when it comes to definition of an hernia, I think this fills the gap. Any abdominal wall gap with or without a bulge in the area of a postoperative scar, perceptible or palpable by clinical examination or imaging. 10 years back, if you had asked me, I would have said the best diagnosis, and still holds good, is a clinical examination. But with a lot of imaging modalities like MRI and dynamic MRIs, sometimes what is not obvious on clinical can always be brought about by dynamic MRI imaging or dynamic ultrasound. So with that, we go to the classification of hernias. The European Hernia Society has offered a classification in 2009, which is a very simplified and easily reproducible. But what needs to be done is for all the hernia societies to come together, standardize this hernia classification and accept it the world over. So if you see this, you have, this is for ventral hernia. Based on the size of the defect, you have 2 centimeters, 2 to 4 and more than 4 centimeters. Now why this is important is, this will help you to compare results. If somebody in Spain says, I do all my meshes only, and we do not know what is the size of the defect, what is the BMI of the patient. Now when you have a standardization like this will help you to find out whether the procedure has got reasonable standards and whether you can compare the results. When it comes to incisional hernia, the European Hernia Society has given again a simplified version. You define it as either a midline or a lateral hernia, and based on the location you start M1 to M5, starting from the xiphoid right up to the suprapubic. When it comes to the lateral hernias, you have subcostal, flank, iliac and lumbar. And based on the width, again we have less than 4, 4 to 10 and more than 10 centimeters. So this is an acceptable classification which you can follow throughout your career, and all your hernias which you document in your clinical practice, you need to classify them. Am I dealing with an M3 and what is the size of the defect? This is very important to know what your results are and recurrences in terms of the plan of repair. Now when you have an incisional hernia, you can always place in a mesh. Depending on the location, if you place it on top of the aponeurosis, it's called a non-lay repair. If you place it behind, you can always call it a retromuscular repair or a sublay repair. And with laparoscopy comes a new position of a mesh which is called an intraperitoneal onlay mesh. So these are the normal standardized placement of meshes that one would encounter in the surgical practice. Now what is best? This is beyond the scope of this talk to say what procedure is best, but each is an acceptable procedure and you need to compare the results. Based on the position of the mesh and the approach, laparoscopy offers one, an intraperitoneal onlay mesh. We will come to that in detail. When you close the defect, it's called an IPOM plus. When you do a composite mesh which is exposed to the intestine partly and partly covered by peritoneum, it's called tape. So it's transabdominal, partly extraperitoneal, usually done for suprapubic hernias. When it is tapped, when you have a small defect like an umbilical hernia, you can raise only the peritoneum and place it just in front of the peritoneum, which is preperitoneal, akin to what you do for an inguinal hernia, which is called a tap procedure. It's called tap. Now when you reflect the peritoneum and the rectus sheath together and place the mesh behind the rectus through a transabdominal approach, then it is called a transabdominal retromuscular. So when you access the peritoneal cavity and place a mesh in any of these 4 locations, you can call it an laparoscopic procedure. But if you do not access the peritoneal cavity and you go through a port and create a potential space, then it is called an endoscopic procedure. This is a reef stopper which has been in vogue for many years and now has become popularized because of this approach, which is an endoscopic reef stopper approach. Now when you divide this transverse abdominis muscle, it is called an endoscopic posterior component separation along with a transverse abdominal or ETAR approach. You can also do an anterior component separation through an endoscopic means, in which case it's called an endoscopic component separation. So these are the various approaches for placement of the mesh. We will come to that one by one.